not further ado, let's begin with our story, the preservation of Clissold Park. And it all begins with a Facebook post. So as I mentioned, I often take photos and I go around and I post them on Twitter with a little caption about the history of that building or that boot scraper or whatever that is. And a while ago, that was December 2015, I was walking in the park and I took a photo of the Commemorative Fountain that some of you might be familiar with. And it actually has a nice inscription dedicating it to Joseph Beck and John Ronce. And I posted it just like I do every day. And I think the first comment was the one that's highlighted. Someone saying, hey, Joseph Beck is our great, 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 great grandfather. And I was really excited because when you get one of those comments, then straight away I say, maybe you have additional material, maybe some family photos that I haven't seen. And I got in touch with Isabella and I said, I'd love to see if you have anything else. And she said, actually, we do. You can see the comment below, some cuttings and whatnot. And I really thought it was just going to be a little booklet, a little souvenir, maybe a few letters or whatnot. And we met up and she brought this. And this was astonishing. This was a complete treasure trove of the entire campaign. So that news cuttings book, as I'm going to show you, contained every letter, every news cutting, maps, invitations to events, posters about public meetings and so on. And I was completely blown away by it. This was the story of the campaign. And if you read some of the local history books, in most cases, the campaign is described in a few lines saying there was an outcry, there was a campaign, and they protested, campaigned, and they saved the park. And I always wondered what really happened, what almost happened on a daily basis, what was the process of securing the preservation of the park. And this news cuttings book had everything. You can see it was very thick, and we met on, I think it was Saturday or Sunday in the cafe, and you can just imagine my amazement just flicking through this treasure and just being completely amazed by the wealth of content that it contained. All of it, every piece of information that you can see, this is just the collage that gives you that bird's eye view. In total, there were 175 items, and that's a lot. I created a special website called savingclissoldpark.com that has all of this material online. Some of it is transcribed. So if you have a very long weekend to kill, then you can go online and really delve into this. What I'm going to do in this talk is just provide a few glimpses into some of these artifacts and some of these items to piece together the story, because what I had to do was read through all this and start working out the dates and all the activities and the petitions and the different public meetings that had to be held. And it was quite fascinating to really piece the whole puzzle together and connecting the dots. What I want to do, first of all, is take a step back and talk about the area that we know today as Clissold Park, its evolution and its history, just so we have a bit of context. This was the park in 1741. This is, I think, the earliest map that I could find that has the park. It's labeled as Newington Common. And you can clearly see that at that point, Stoke Newington was nothing more than a tiny rural village surrounded by fields and meadows. The population, the very small population, was centered around Church Street, a few houses also on the junction with the High Street, but this was pretty much it. This is the area of the park that we know today in terms of its boundaries. And it's interesting to see how those boundaries were formed and what was the different steps and stages that got us to where we are today. The first person that is mentioned with the creation of the park is a local Quaker called Jonathan Hoare. He lived on Church Street, where Millington House is now, in a nice big house called Paradise House. He was a local banker, merchant, had quite a few, I guess, sort of money to spend, quite an extravagant lifestyle from what I read. And he decided that he wanted to move out from the family home and build a house for himself. And he built the house that we know today as Clissold House. He actually called it Paradise House, which was the name of his family home. And you can clearly see in blue there the area that he bought. So it was the house and the area around it. And this was his little patch, if you like. And the family itself is quite famous. So as a banking dynasty, if you want, the Horge is the second oldest bank in the UK and the world's fifth oldest bank. If you walk down Fleet Street at any point, you can actually see their offices. So it's the same one, the same family. They had quite a footprint in the area. This was the house that we all know very well. This is a photo from 1876, before it was a public park. And it's really nice to see it quite bare, quite raw. There's no benches. It's very quiet. You can almost imagine that people would not just sort of go in. It was private land. But the house itself hasn't really changed over the years. But interestingly, when you think about Clissold House in the context of the other mansions, it was a bit different, because if you look at this kind of collection of other mansions and big houses, all of them were lining up Church Street or the High Street, because that was basically Stoke Newington. So you had Ebony House and Daniel Defoe's house and Fleetwood House, a 60-room mansion where the fire station is today. But Paradise House was more secluded, was further back from Church Street. And in retrospect, that's actually what saved it, because a lot of those other big mansions were pulled down when Victorian houses were built in their place. In the case of Paradise House that you can see in the bottom left, in the 1930s, when social housing was built, so those kind of old houses made way. But Clissold House was saved, and I believe it is because it was slightly further away from Church Street. And in 1791, Jonathan maybe thought, I've got the nice house, I want to have a nice front garden to go along with it. And he bought the leasehold for a big chunk of land that's highlighted there, with the nice New River as a nice view when you wake up in the morning and you have your cup of coffee. But this was if you like, the boundaries of his estate. All the area where the ponds are and the tennis courts and the play area and all that, that was not part of his original estate. But as I mentioned, Jonathan was quite extravagant, and even though he was part of this sort of banking dynasty, he ran into financial difficulties. He couldn't make the repayments, and the house was foreclosed. He had to give it away, and I'm not sure if he moved back to the original Paradise House or just got a one-bedroom flat on the High Street or something like that, but he lost Clissold House. The next person to move in was a gentleman by the name of Thomas Gudgeon. He moved in. We don't really have any drawings or paintings of his, so this is just an illustrative portrait that I imagine he might have looked like. And he moved in, had the removals and all that done. This is a nice painting from 1804, and you can see just at the bottom where it says the seat of Thomas Gudgeon, Esquire, Stoke Newington, Middlesex, and very clearly we can see the house. This is meant to be Paradise Bridge, which was just on Church Street, where the 393 bus stop is, the eastbound, exactly where the lamppost is today. And you can also see St. Mary's Old Church. Very nice piece of property. But Thomas had a neighbor. His neighbor was William Crochet. This is an account from one of the news cuttings that described the history of the ground. And you can very clearly see that William Crochet, who was an ironmaster from Wales, I think he was referred to or described as the richest commoner in the land. So made his business, the family business, was all about steel and iron and ammunition. He moved next door. He wasn't a very nice person. He was trying to move up in society, and having a nice estate in Stoke Newington was one of those things you wanted to have. And he really pastored Thomas Gudgeon to get the house and get the land. And eventually he was successful. And you can see that by 1811, the property or the boundaries of the land is exactly what we know today to be Clissold Park. So you've got the red bit, which was William Crochet's, and then you've got the Thomas Gudgeon, the blue, and the other area as well that he bought as well. This is a nice engraving from the mid 1840s. I'm not sure that those people actually came. I think the artists maybe just have added them just to kind of make it a bit more lively. But you can see that originally the New River bent and ran along Church Street. It was only drained and filled in 1958. Sorry, it now terminates in the East Reservoir. But you can really get a sense of the grandeur and the sense of what the estate was like. Now, William had a daughter, her name was Eliza. She lived with him in the house. And she got really infatuated with the local curate, Augustus Clissold. Augustus was just next door in the old church, and there was a love story, but it was very much a Romeo and Juliet. William Crochet was completely against it. He didn't allow them to meet. There were stories about them throwing notes over the fence. Very romantic, very romantic. You can imagine that for William, for his daughter to marry a curate of a church wasn't maybe the person that he imagined she would end up with. So he was dead against it, and they had to wait. And in 1834, William passed away, and Augustus and Eliza married. Augustus made the very short move from the church or wherever he lived next to it to the house. And he effectively owned the estate as the husband of Eliza. It was really interesting for me to find clippings. This was not in the original archive, but you can see that even though this was a private estate, this was the home of Augustus and Eliza. In the 1860s, they would sometimes open the park for special events. These are just two news cuttings I was able to find that are quite meaningful, I think, because it shows that even though the park was a private estate, it wasn't this gated area that no one knew what it was like. It wasn't something that was a secret or hidden. People sometimes had a chance to visit and really appreciate and enjoy all that space. So when the land came under threat and there was real risk that something might happen, they could very easily think about what they were about to lose, because it was a place that they visited in the past. This is 1877. Eliza passed away. Augustus was left on his own. You can see the listing from the directory, and it has the names and the addresses of people. And I like how for the Reverend Augustus Clissold, the address is simply the park, Stoke Newington, right? And I think, I guess we all wish we had that as our address, but I always thought it was quite interesting how that got listed. There's no mention of the house or anything like that. It's just the park. Augustus probably felt quite lonely in the big estate. This is an actual photo from around that time, the 1870s. And as you can imagine, there were no benches, there were no railings. This was almost rural land. You had the house, you had the New River, and then you had this open space, almost sort of untamed. And this was the view that Augustus and Eliza would have seen. This is also the view that people that would have visited on those occasions would have appreciated. In 1877, Augustus moved to his other house in Tunbridge Wells. Maybe he felt that staying in Stoke Newington on his own was too painful. And in 1882, he passed away. This is his grave. I believe it's the darker one. And he's buried next to Eliza. He was buried with his sister, Diana Clissold. They didn't have any children. So this is their resting place. Now, once Augustus passed away, the whole estate moved back to the Crochet family. George Crochet was the nephew of Eliza, so it reverted back to the family, and he took over. It was quite nice of him to open part of the park on weekends to locals, which was a really nice gesture. And again, it shows you that people, even though it wasn't a public park in any sense, but it was clearly a place that people knew, people visited. They had a deep appreciation of it if it's a place that they could actually visit on the weekends. But by 1884, it was a big estate, it was a big land. George ran into some financial difficulties, and this is a letter that he wrote in 1884, and I'll tell you in a minute who was the recipient, but you can see that he was toying with the idea of selling part of it for building purposes, but maybe preserving the rest as an open space. And he was making inquiries about how can he make it happen, who would be interested in purchasing it and making it into a public park. This is a map that was in the collection. It's not dated, but I suspect, because he does mention a map in the letter, that this may have been that map. And potentially those numbers may have been future building plots, potentially, and the yellow bit that was designated as a future public park. But very, very surprisingly, without telling anyone, in 1886, he sold the whole lot to the church commissioners. And from their perspective, they had this big piece of land. they were looking to sell it off for building purposes. And this became a real issue. Now, just to appreciate just how much of a shock that was for people at the time, if you look at what Stoke Newington looked like in 1846, you can see it was very rural. It was still a small village, a countryside, and effectively a lot of meadows, a lot of green field, and building was very limited. You've got a drawing at the top of Abney House, and below that you've got another one of those streets, but people lived in a very nice, picturesque village. But very quickly, in relative terms, all that changed. And you can see that by the 1890s, all those green fields and all those meadows were completely covered in houses. You have Abney Park, you've got the reservoirs, and Clissold as the only open spaces in Stoke Newington. So when the church commissioners put the park on the market, people got very worried. It's worth noting as well that preservation of open spaces for the public and the concern and anxiety about losing open spaces was not clearly limited to Stoke Newington. There was a wider open space movement during the Victorian era. These are just a few of the very notable individuals that campaigned and worked very tirelessly to preserve open spaces for the well-being and the health of people. They could just see how the Jerry Builder was moving so closely and how all those green fields were disappearing. This is a nice listing of parks and when they opened. That was part of the archive. And you can see you've got Finsbury Park at the top, and you've got all the other parks, and Clissold is listed at the very bottom, 1889. And I really thought it was really nice how people in some of the clippings, they refer to parks as the lungs of the metropolis. You have to remember there was a lot of air pollution, a lot of soot, a lot of smoke, even in residential areas like where we live now. So to have the ability to go to an open space that offered clean air was a real luxury that was disappearing very quickly. At this point, I'd like to introduce you to my hero and the person that we should be grateful and thankful to every time we step foot in the park. This is Joseph Beck. Joseph Beck lived in Barton House, where the surgery is now. And this is, if you had a business card, this is what it would look like. Joseph Beck was your quintessential Renaissance man, your typical Victorian that was doing so many things. He was a very colorful, quite eccentric character. He was an avid traveler, mountaineer, cyclist. He was an optical microscope manufacturer. He was a local politician. He was very much involved in civic life, in the local vestry. He actually paid for policing on the weekends when George Crochet would open the park for the public. This is a nice quote that is mentioned in one of his letters. And when he found out that the church commissioners were about to sell Clissold Park to the builders, he got very alarmed and he decided to do something about it. This is, as I mentioned, Joseph was a renowned manufacturing optician. His company is very well known. They made telescopes and lenses. And even if you just Google Beck microscopes, you can see they're very expensive and very pricey on eBay if you can find an original one. Barton House, as I mentioned, was just where the surgery is today. He had quite famous family members as well. His uncle, Joseph Jackson Lister, invented the modern microscope. You can see that in the Science Museum. His cousin was also very famous, Joseph Lister. He's again regarded as the father of modern surgery. So you can clearly see that Joseph Beck was coming from a very successful family, very renowned individuals. A few years ago, I realized and found out that in Yokeley Road, where the old Quaker burial ground used to be, you can still see all the headstones. And I went through all of them and I took photos of all of them. And you can actually see the headstone of Joseph Jackson Lister, just kind of leaning against the wall, cars parking on it. It's really sad. But if you go at the car park of the church that's there now, you can get a view of all those headstones. As I mentioned, this was Barton House before the GP surgery that we know there was built. It was named after Thomas Barton Beck, who was Joseph's paternal grandfather. And it's quite nice that the name has remained to this very day. This is what it looks like today. Okay, so a view that I know everyone recognizes. This is Joseph and his wife, Emma, when he was a young, dashing man. He spent all of his life in the area. He grew up in Stamford Hill, lived for a period in Church Street, and then moved to Barton House. This is Joseph with his children in the back garden of Barton House. This is your quintessential Victorian family. I just love how everyone has such a distinct expression, looking in different directions, even the dog. I mean, it's almost like your typical Stoke Newington dog. So you can see that there are clear roots and heritage there as well. When you think about the task that Joseph took upon himself to save the park and the reasoning behind that, if you take a step back, we know that Stoke Newington has a long heritage and history of social reform and equality. Quite a few individuals, most of them were Quakers. You can see fought for the abolishment of slavery, promoting girls' education, and green spaces and the open spaces movement really fits within that narrative of social reform, caring for society, thinking about your fellow being and their well-being, their mental well-being as well as their physical well-being. Joseph Beck was a Quaker, and if you look at other examples of Quakers and what they've done, there's a nice link when you look at environmental activism as we think about it today in the context of social welfare, and you look at the role that Quakers played in creating the allotments movement or the Cadbury's story and the whole ethos that they had about the well-being of their workers and the use of open spaces and gardens. In that context, I think that Joseph is a very good example, but it's not surprising that he decided to go down that route and do something about it. So what did Joseph do? I mean, he realized that there was probably a big sign on the outside the park saying for sale. Maybe a bulldozer was already moving. The first thing he did was set up a committee, the Clissold Park Preservation Committee. And this is the names of all the individuals. They're all men, as you'd expect at the time. And it's interesting when you look at the addresses, you can see all of them were affluent businessmen, judges, MPs, quite sort of upper middle class gentlemen. And most of them, I think, lived in Lordship Park as well, if you actually look at the addresses. I want to just pause for a minute on just sort of one name, and that's John Ronce. John Ronce lived in Lordship Park in Linton Lodge, just on the corner. It's no longer there. And he was, if you like, kind of the McCartney to Joseph Beck's Lennon. And they worked very, very close on this. They were partners in crime. And John Ronce also has an incredible and a very impressive CV. He was involved in preservation of Hackney Downs, Mill Hill Fields, Newton Green, and Finsbury Park. He was a music teacher. He was the foundation headmaster of the Birkbeck schools. He was very much involved in children's education, but primarily working class children as well. Like Joseph Beck, he was also a Stoke Newington vestryman. So it's very easy to see why the two of them, they knew each other very well. And when the campaign started, it was really the two of them that were at the forefront. This is a lovely photo of the two of them just before they both passed away the same year, by the way, 1891. Joseph Beck is in the middle. You've got John Ronce. Again, your kind of Victorian clothing, beards, the whole thing. This could actually maybe be in the park when it was being prepared to open to the public, because there was a lot of work to get it ready. But I think it's a really nice sort of photo seeing them both together. The asking price when they went to the church commissioners and say, don't sell it, we'll buy it, or we'll find someone to buy it and keep it as a public park, turn it into a public park. The asking price that the church commissioners put on the park was £95,000. And to get a sense of what was that in 1886, there's a few calculators that you can run. Kind of the Bank of England has a few inflation calculators and so on. But usually the amount that comes up is around the kind of the 12 million, 13 million mark, which if you think about it today, is still quite cheap. But at the time, it was a lot of money. And they had to start find out, where can we get the money from? Now, to make things more complicated, the church commissioners effectively said that that's the price up until this date, up until September 29th, 1886. There's going to be a 4% annual interest until completion, which is a lot of money. So the clock was ticking. Every day mattered, every week, every month, because the price kept going up, up, and up. So what they started doing was getting to the public backing and getting public interest in the preservation of the park. These are some of the posters and the cards in the archive. You can see that they held these public meetings, and these posters are really nice and big, mint condition. They would look really nice framed in someone's house maybe one day. A lot of fonts going on there as well. This is a news cutting that gives you a sense of the atmosphere and what those meetings were like. A lot of those news cuttings are from journalists that describe in great detail the proceedings and who was saying what and what was being discussed in those public meetings. But this was really about generating interest, getting the backing, because it wasn't going to be down to those 65 members of the committee to save the park. So they had a plan, and let's see what happened to that plan. So the first plan was to ask the Metropolitan Board of Works to purchase the park. The Metropolitan Board of Works was, if you like, almost like the London Council that was responsible for open spaces, sanitation, street lights, all the infrastructure in London. And the idea was to go to them and saying, can you please buy this park so we have a nice open space to go away from all the smoke and all the soot. Now, there was a problem. When you look at Clissold, and even in old maps, what you see is that, technically speaking, the land was split between two parishes. One was Hornsey Parish, and the other one was Stoke Newington Parish. It doesn't make much difference to us today, but back then that was a big problem. Because what happened was that, as you're going to see in a minute, while Stoke Newington was within the metropolis boundaries, which was the area that the Metropolitan Board of Works administered, Hornsey was not. I know. You can still find a few boundary markers, like this one behind the bins by the Church Street entrance. You can see the bus stop, and you can see exactly where the boundary was between Hornsey Parish and Stoke Newington. This is one facing Green Lanes. This is an 1887 boundary marker. You can clearly see this is a Hornsey Parish one, number 175. These were dotted all over the place. There are only very few of them remaining today, but back in the day, there were loads. And this is the annoying thing. If you look at the map of the area that the Metropolitan Board of Works would have covered, half of the park was outside, and they would not even consider purchasing it. So at the very least, they would only consider buying the Stoke Newington half, which was very disappointing. So the asking price for them was, okay, can you just contribute £50,000 to buy that portion of the park? The plan then became, okay, how do we get the rest of the money? There was another charitable organization that was called the Charity Commissioners. And as you can see from this map, their area was much bigger. So they thought, okay, let's get the Stoke Newington half from the Metropolitan Board of Works, and let's get the Charity Commissioners to buy the Hornsey bit. And then we're good. You know, two bodies donating the money, and it should be fine. And this basically led to a number of things now. These are beautiful letters that are part of the archive. I believe there are about maybe 12 to 15. These are letters that Joseph Beck, either he wrote or a scribe wrote, that went out to all the committee members. And they would update them on progress. They would tell them what is expected, where they should meet next time. You can even see the address with the old number, 97 Albion Road, Barton House. And in this letter, Joseph Beck refers to the petitions, because having the public meetings was good, but they also had to get people to sign up. And this is a beautiful petition that I found in the Metropolitan Archives in Clerkenwell. And in total, they got 12,000 people to sign it, I believe. And you can see that it's 400 pages, 30 signatures per page, and it's a very long scroll. And it's really interesting because, as you can see, it's almost like a yellow pages of the area. You've got people's names and the addresses, and all this is online as well, by the way. So if you want to look for an ancestor and see if they signed the petition, you can do that. You can see all the names, kind of really nice and orderly. And this was something that they presented to the Charity Commissioners, to the Metropolitan Board of Works, and really showed them, look, there's such a great public interest in preserving the park. Let's do something about it. The next thing they had to do was get a bill in Parliament, a private bill, because if you wanted to get a park to be purchased for the public, you had to get a private bill in Parliament. And this was going to take a while. This is just a snippet of what that Act of Parliament was about. I'll just kind of leave it there for a second. And you can see that it was if you like, almost like a bureaucratic technical step that had to take place in order for the park to be purchased by the Metropolitan Board of Works using all the money that was going to be raised. I won't bore you with the details, but you can see that from January 1887, it took all the way to summer to finalize and do all the drafts and so on. And the clock was ticking. Don't forget about that interest payment, always ticking, and the amount is going up, 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 and up. But eventually they managed to get the bill. This is a letter from July 1887, and they're talking about, okay, we need to now continue and progress. I'm just gonna skip through a few of those. One of the problems they face now, and there were quite a lot, so that's what I said, you're gonna really appreciate the park much, much more after this presentation. Turns out that the Metropolitan Board of Works was only willing to contribute 25,000, not the full 50,000 that was asked originally. And it created a real problem because where do you get the rest of the money? To add to that, to make things more difficult, Joseph Beck, he was the mouthpiece of the campaign. He would go and present in all the big events. He was the one that presented the petitions, but he was also a heavy smoker. And in 1887, he suffered a cancer of the tongue and had to undergo a very painful procedure. From what I read, he lost part of his tongue. I'm not sure which one of these instruments was used, but I think his cousin was involved. So maybe at least that helped to numb the pain. But it really makes you appreciate Joseph Beck's tireless effort and continuous actions to continue the campaign. This is a letter that starts to give you a sense of where they're going to get the money. So 47,500 from the charity commissioners. We're going to get the 25,000 from them. Stock Newington is going to contribute 10,000. South Hornsey 6,000. And the plan was to go to Islington and ask for £10,000, and that would probably be it, just to finish the story. Because even though the park was not in Islington, but let's be honest, a lot of people from Islington, even today, from Highbury and far, far away places, they come to enjoy the park. So the view was, let's ask them to chip in. The problem was that this is now March 1888, right? So we started in about September 1886. Islington were not too keen on being part of this for a number of reasons that I'm going to show you. This is one of the letters, and you can see the word great difficulty underlined, because they start to realize that Islington were not playing ball. They were resisting and making it very difficult. There were also a lot of rumors being said about the cost and so on. This is another public meeting that was held in March 1888. And it really tries, as you can see from this, to get people to understand that, first of all, the contribution was going to be a loan that was going to be repaid over 50 years. And when you actually break it down and saying over 50 years, what's going to be the economical impact on every ratepayer in the parish, it was minuscule. It was absolutely nothing. And at the bottom, you can see that the campaigners made the economical case as well, of saying, look, if you don't save the park, the value of all the houses will depreciate. You're going to lose more in terms of the income sort of rate that you're collecting now than you would by participating in the purchase of the park. The Islington vestry meetings were quite rowdy. These are just some of the headlines. You can see there was a lot of noise. They were asked to then maybe donate only 5,000, and they weren't too happy about that as well. At the very end, they were willing to make the smallest contribution out of all, which was basically just £2,500. Okay, so that was Islington contribution. I like the fact that in the archive as well, they saved some letters by people opposing the whole campaign. There was quite strong opposition. Not everyone was in favor. I'm just going to let you read that for a second while I sip some water. These are some of the very vocal opposition to the plan to purchase the park, referring to the Clissold Park, swamp, and swindle. Vermin gorging on our Islington cheese. Yeah, very, very picturesque. And this is another one. This is claiming that Joseph Beck and some of his committee members were house owners that were worried about the value of their houses depreciating if the land was sold. This was an absolute lie. Joseph Beck, like most Victorians, was renting, believe it or not. He didn't actually own Barton House. And there were a lot of those rumors and a lot of those sort of, if you like, fake news said about Joseph Beck personally and about the campaign. This is another letter saying it's too expensive. We should spend it on streets, on lights in the streets and pavements and roads. Not everyone was in favor. And this is the point where there's thought about alternatives. Do we ask the church commissioners maybe to keep some of the park, maybe the area fronting Green Lanes, and then reduce the asking price by 10,000 so we can get away without the Islington contribution, but we will end up with a smaller park. This is a lovely map as well that's included in the archive. It's really nice and big. And you can see there's all these kind of almost sketches of the different amounts and the freehold, I believe. And maybe this is them in Barton House trying to come up with different alternatives and different sort of schemes of how can we save the park. Maybe we keep this and we let them do that. It's a beautiful map. And you can see that Joseph was not giving up. He was writing letters to the local newspapers, letting them know that the campaign, even though we're now in 1888, it's been a while, that they're not giving up. A lot of stuff has been going on. He was trying to keep it in kind of in people's view and kind of make sure that they don't forget about the campaign. The last plan they had, this is Plan D, by the way, right? I'm kind of going through this, but imagine like 2 years of all these turbulent meetings and all these setbacks and all these disappointments. The last plan they could think of is to ask Hackney to contribute £5,000 and basically make the rest. They would hand out these invitations and kind of admission cards when they had people visiting the park to really admire its beauty. That was one of their techniques, one of their methods of really getting people to appreciate the land rather than just asking for money. And those are also in the archive. Another little news clipping talking about the decision to go ahead and contribute that money. So it's 15,000 in total, but that's split between Stoke Newington and Hackney. So they got the money. Great news, they got the money finally. The bad news was that by that point there was a bit of an interest to pay, but luckily John Ronce, who I mentioned at the beginning, he went to the church commissioners and he worked his charm and he got them to forego that interest. Because if it wasn't for John Ronce, and if they didn't forego that interest payment, Clissold Park would not be where it is now. There's no doubt that the campaign would have completely fallen flat, because by that point, there was just nowhere else to go. You might have had to go to a very distant parish, and that would not have worked. And this is the happy ending. You can see some letters that Joseph Beck received at the end. This is a lovely photo of him on his hammock with his dog. Right, and he's smiling, you know, maybe he's got half a tongue, but he's smiling because after those 2 years, all the efforts, having to keep up the business, having to go through his operation and all those things, he managed to save the park. This is just a close-up of one of those letters. I'm going to hand over to my very helpful assistant, Nick, in a minute, just to play a short video for you. But you can see that there was a lot of appreciation. Joseph Beck was hailed as a local hero by everyone that really, really appreciated all the effort that he spent and took with the rest of the committee members to secure the preservation of the park. They had to do some work before the park actually opened. These are some plans that I found as well, that if you go back to the way the park was when Augustus Clissold lived there, like I said, there was no drainage, there were no benches, railings. It wasn't ready for the public to just move in and start barbecuing and playing tennis. So they had to do quite a bit of work that took a bit of time. And the opening ceremony was on July 24th, 1889. This is the original invite to that opening ceremony that's also in the archive. Beautiful. It looks like it was printed yesterday. And you can see the whole setup and where people will go and who's invited. This is one of only 2 photos that were taken during that very festive, happy day of the opening ceremony. There's another one that looks very, very similar to this one, but it's slightly different. Right, just a nice close-up. You can see it's completely packed. I don't know if they're all just queuing for coffee. Not much social distancing going on, but we can forgive them. It was a very, very special day. But you can see everyone just packing on the roof, on the balcony, everyone very, very happy. They had a few speeches and a few, Joseph Beck said a few words and so on. And I'll just let you read this for a second because you can see that people didn't forget about Islington. They didn't forget about the very small contribution and all the difficulty that they created for the campaign. So when the contributions were read out loud and Islington's contribution was mentioned. You can see there were hisses and laughter and uncomplimentary demonstration because of the comparative smallness of that contribution. So yeah, Islington, we never forget. And in 1890, as a show of appreciation to Joseph Beck and John Ronce, really the two figures that made the whole thing happen, locals donated money and erected a commemorative fountain. And 120 years later, a local historian went around, took a photo of that commemorative fountain, posted it on Facebook, and here we are. So this is the story. I think I'm just about time. We can spend a whole day as a seminar talking about this, but the last thing I'll show you is a commemorative plaque that I organized a few years ago for Joseph Beck. I felt that in addition to the fountain, it'll be nice if there's also recognition or a mention of him somewhere else in the area. And I thought that the site of Barton House, where all those meetings were held, was the most fitting place to do that, really just to mark the space. This was a mock-up, and I contacted Hackney Council and Barton GP and managed to get the funding from the Clissold Park user group and also from Beck's family. So that was great. They were both very generous to make it happen. This was probably a very happy day to see the plaque actually going on the building. And we had a very moving, very wet unveiling ceremony in November of 2018. And it was amazing to see descendants of both the John Ronce and Joseph Beck. So we had Joseph Beck's great-great-great-grandchildren, and they got to meet John Ronce's great-great-grandson. So that was a beautiful occasion. There was a lot of rain, torrential rain, but everyone stayed there. It was really, really beautiful. The last thing I'm gonna do now is ask Nick to just play a video that it's reading a letter that Joseph Beck wrote and sent to one of the newspapers that really summarizes the whole campaign in one letter. And I combined that with a lot of imagery of the park, and hopefully you'll enjoy it. So I'm going to shut up and I'm going to take questions after this.
To the editor of the Weekly Recorder. Sir, the time has at length arrived when I can throw aside the reserve I have thought it prudent to maintain, and congratulate the inhabitants of North London on having secured for their use forever 53 acres of the most beautiful park in the neighbourhood of the metropolis. So long as negotiations were pending, I abstained from alluding to the criticisms, sometimes not very complimentary, but mostly commendatory, on the part I have taken in the matter. It must not be forgotten how much of our success has been due to the active support of a very influential committee. As regards allusions adverse to myself, I can afford to forgive and forget. No one ever engages in any good work without exposing himself to having his motives misunderstood. What concerns your readers more is the query, what has the Clissold Park Preservation Committee accomplished? The park will shortly be in the hands of the public, and they will be able to judge for themselves as to the natural beauties it possesses. And this boon they will have obtained without, as far as I'm prepared to show, it having cost the inhabitants of the adjoining districts one single penny. The local authorities have subscribed £23,500 out of a total cost of £95,000. This contribution of £23,500 is to be spread over a period of 50 years, so that a sum of about £1,000 will have to be raised each year to extinguish the principal and interest. Owing to the number of new houses built all around, the old-fashioned houses have been emptied for those possessing modern conveniences. At the same time, owing to the crowded condition of the neighbourhood, it has not been worth the landlord's while to rebuild these old and inconvenient tenements. Thus there are a large number of empties, all of which are included in the assessment and cause a great loss to the rates. Now that we have prevented Clissold Park from being covered with some thousands of small houses, now that there is so charming a recreation ground in the neighbourhood, It will be worthwhile for the landlords to replace the old-fashioned houses with new ones, and the result will be a great gain to the rates, far greater than the amount which will have to be paid towards the cost of the park. This is no visionary notion, but a certainty which must result from our action. I know that some will say your remarks may be true as concerned Stoke Newington and South Hornsey, but how about Hackney and Islington? I would reply, all will share the benefit. There has been too much disposition to endeavour to raise antagonistic feelings between different districts. Such notions, I trust, are fading away under a much higher duty of each doing its part towards the general mass and working together for the common good. It will be from the narrow streets of Shoreditch and from the pent-up alleys of Clerkenwell and Islington that thousands and tens of thousands of our fellow beings will issue to enjoy the sweet breezes and lie under the shade of the old and handsome trees of Clissold Park. It will be on the soft grass that the little ones will romp and play and learn the charm of getting for a short time under the benignant influence of bright sunshine and fresh air. The matter is now taken out of our hands. The Metropolitan Board of Works and the Ecclesiastical Commissioners have now to settle the necessary legal transfers. It will be a delight to the former body, if they are to be supplanted, to accomplish this grand work as a final memorial of their good deeds. And I feel sure the latter body will rejoice that whilst they have not done injustice to those great trusts they administer, means have been found to prevent the desecration of those green fields and the cutting down of those grand old trees which, planted by our ancestors, have for more than 100 years adorned the spot. And now one word in conclusion, personal to myself. I have most cordially to thank the committee for their valuable services. I have to thank Mr. J. Ronce, our member at the Metropolitan Board of Works, for his untiring efforts and valuable cooperation. I have to thank the Ecclesiastical Commissioners for the liberal and courteous manner in which they have met us at the Charity Commissioners for their liberal construction of the Clissold Park Act, the Metropolitan Board of Works for their generous aid, and the public boards for their support. The press for the public spirit they have shown, and their readiness to throw open their columns to us in times of need, and the general public who often, when the prospects seem dark and the future doubtful, have encouraged us by their enthusiasm and materially aided us in accomplishing the object of our efforts. Believe me, yours obediently, Joseph Beck, Chairman of the Clissold Park Preservation Committee, Barton House, Albion Road, Stoke Newington, July the 30th, 1888.